Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you were able to stop by and spend a little bit of time with me on Halloween while you're getting ready for the spooky night. Today I'm going to be making a ghost dragon to celebrate Halloween. Anyways, let's get started. So I'm going to be starting on the clay pieces first, and like always I'm going to start with the clay head first and then we'll move on to making the clay feet. So I'm going to take a lump of tin foil and I'm going to start covering it in clay and smoothing everything out. Pretty much just making a base so we can have something to work with. Now this piece I'm doing a little bit differently than I originally pictured it, because at first, since I'm doing a ghost and it is Halloween, I thought something scary and creepy would be a good idea, but as I was making the clay pieces I decided to go for something more beautifully sad in a way. So this is actually going to be more inspired off of a bride ghost. So we're going to be doing all whites, maybe hints of very light colors here and there just so it's not just a flat white, and we're just going to go for something kind of beautifully creepy. So for the head I decided to go with more of an angular, kind of thin, more bird-like shape for this dragon. And then to make it a little bit more elegant and feminine, I am not going to give it giant horns or anything like that. I'm going to add just maybe some rough scaling on the top of the head. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So I'm going to get the shape down for the head, make sure it's very bird-like, very thin and elegant, and then we can add the eyes to it. Now I had these really cool glass eyes I've been wanting to use forever, and I figured they'd be really good for this piece because they're very light and they just have hints of color here and there. So they kind of look ghostly to me. So I'm going to lay these out on the head, start building up around them to make the cheekbones, the muscles, the eyelids and stuff like that, and just keep adding features until I like it. Now since I was going for more of a bird-like look, I decided to go for more of a predatory bird, so I'm going to have the eyes facing very forward, kind of like a hawk or an eagle would have their eyes. And then after I have the placement of the eyes, I'm going to draw out the shape of the mouth. Now I'm not going to have it just stop at the beak, I am going to have it going along the whole side of the face. So I'm going to draw that out, make sure it's nice and even. I'm not going to use a strip of clay, I'm just going to use the clay that I currently have on the face and make a nice line shape for where the mouth would open. And then after I have the placement of the mouth where I like it, I'm going to move on to adding some nostrils. So I'm going to have these more at the very end of the snout where the beak shape is, and I'm just going to kind of push in on both sides. For the decoration, I'm going to be using these little pieces of resin that I made. I'm going to be using these later to make claws as well, but I had extra so I figured I'd use them for the head too. So I'm going to place these on the head where I want them, and then I'm going to take some balls of clay, just some kind of medium-sized ones, and I'm going to push them onto the top of the face, kind of framing the gems that we put on top. So these are just going to be kind of larger, flatter scales. And then after that, the main thing that I need to focus on now is adding texture. So I'm going to use my tools to add some scaling around the eyelids and different things like that, and just kind of roughing up the surface of the clay to make it look a little bit more interesting than the flat smoothness that we have now. While I was adding the texture to the face, I decided that I wanted to frame the lips a little bit more with some larger scales. So I'm going to use my tools and kind of line those out, and then I also wanted to have a little bit of a spiky effect on the jawbone, so I'm going to add a few little spikes here and there, nothing too large. I still want to keep everything kind of small and delicate. Okay, so I really like how this is looking. It looks really bird-like but still dragon-like, so I'm going to put this in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 45 to 55 minutes. And while that's baking, we can start working on our clay feet. And like always with our clay feet, we're going to have a wire frame. Now I made a very simple one. The back legs are very similar to the front legs. The only thing different is I'm going to give the front legs thumbs, so there's an extra digit for that. And then these wireframes are a little bit different than I normally do. Normally I leave the tips of the wire just the way they are, but I decided to round these off because we're going to be doing the claws differently. Like I said, I made claws and stuff ahead of time and I used some of them on the headpiece, and now we're going to use them on the feet. So the first thing that I'm going to do to our wireframe is cover up the portion where all our wires are combined. So I'm going to take a lump of clay, a pretty decent sized one, and just kind of wrap it around the frame. Then I'm going to take some balls of clay. These are all going to be the same size, and these are going to be for the tips of the toes. So I'm going to push these onto the ends of the wire, and this is why we have the wires kind of curved, is because I need something for the balls of clay to hold on to a little bit better. And they're going to kind of fall off if I leave the wires just plain and pointed. So I kind of curved them a bit so they could grab onto the clay. And then once we have the little balls of clay at the ends of the toes, what we're going to do is we're going to take those resin claws that I made, and I'm going to put these at the end of the little balls. So I'm just going to push them into the clay and kind of blend them together a little bit so they don't fall out. Once I have all my claws in place on the feet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-bake just for a little bit to save our work in progress. So I'm going to put these in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably about just 20 or 25 minutes. And then after those have baked for a little bit and they've cooled, we can start working on the bottoms of the feet. So like I normally do, I'm going to take some strips of clay and we're going to start covering up the whole wire frame. While I'm adding these strips of clay to cover up the wire frame, I am doing my best to blend everything together into the clay that's already baked on the wire frame. So I'm just trying to blend everything together and shape it to get the basic shape for the bottom of the foot. Now if you want, once you have the bottom of the foot done, you can pre-bake again like I'm going to do, and I'm just going to bake another 25 minutes at the 275 Fahrenheit. If you don't want to do that, you're welcome to just move on to doing the tops of the feet, but just be careful not to bump the bottoms while you're adding clay. So for the tops of the feet, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be laying scales out. So I just have little balls of clay and I'm going to start at the tips of the toes and work my way up the foot. I'm going to do all the toes until we get to the very base of the foot where they combined, and then we're going to move on to making larger balls of clay for larger scales. And then after we have this done to all of our feet, we can put them in the oven again for one final bake. I'm going to do about 45 minutes this time at the 275 Fahrenheit. Okay, so all of our clay pieces are done. Once they're out of the oven and have cooled, we can start working on the painting. Now with the painting, if you want, you can make this really simple because again, everything is going to be white, so you don't really have to have too much other than some highlights to separate the detail, but I'm going to add more shimmery effects and stuff like that, and even throw in a tiny bit of color to go along with those glass eyes that we used. But I am going to be primering everything a solid white. So I'm going to paint over all of my clay surfaces with a white. I'm going to make sure everything is completely covered, and I'm going to let that dry. Once all my white paint has dried, I'm going to move on to adding some color. Now this is going to be very subtle because I don't want to add too much of it. I just want to have a tiny hint of it along with a shimmering effect. So I'm going to take colors that are very similar to the colors that are in our glass eyes that we used, and I'm going to go around the edges of our scales, just slightly, and I'm going to change them here and there. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to take a pearlescent white paint. So this is more of a shimmery white paint, and I'm going to go over all the scales. Now the only other colors that I wanted to add was just kind of a bit of a creamy color, and this is going to be kind of more around these scales, like the larger scales around the lips, the beak, and then maybe those scales that we have on the jawbone. So I'm just going to add hints of cream here and there to kind of make certain features stand out a bit. And then I'm also adding a very light gray here and there to add some shadowing to the face. That way not everything is just very plain and white, you can get a bit more dimension this way. So I'm just going to keep messing around. I'm adding very subtle colors here and there, so it may not even show up too much on camera, and then I'm going to let everything dry, and then we can peel the paint off of the glass eyes. Now moving on to the clay feet, we're going to be doing the same thing. I'm going to primer everything white. I'm going to do my best to not get paint on my resin claws because for some reason it's just really hard to peel off the paint on resin. It's really easy on glass, but with the resin it sticks a lot more. I think it's more porous. So I'm just going to paint everything but the claws, and I'm going to let that dry. And then for the scales on the tops of the feet, we're going to be doing the same thing that we did with the scales on the head, and I'm going to use those colors that we use to add highlights and stuff, and we're going to go along the sides of the feet. So I'm just going to go along the sides. I'm not going to go in between the toes or anything, just the sides of the feet. Let that dry, and then paint over all those scales with my pearlescent. So I'm going to paint my front feet and my back feet. It's very simple. I'm not going to add anything really else to it. And once those have dried along with the face, we can mix up some resin and paint over all the work that we did. Those are going to have to cure overnight, so I'm going to set them somewhere safe to dry, and then we can start working on the sewing for the body. Okay, so this is a pattern that I drew out to make our dragon's body. I left it pretty simple. It's just a basic dragon shape. The only thing different is I am going to have the legs slightly longer to make it look a little bit more bird-like to go along with the other features. So just like with all the clay pieces, everything is going to be white. So I'm going to have a strip of fabric going down the back of the dragon, and I'm going to use fur fabric for this. So I have a piece for the neck and a piece for the back of the dragon, and I'm going to sew these two together. And then all the fabric for the rest of the body is going to be a very short white plush fabric. So I'm going to start with the legs now, and I'm going to sew all the fronts of them together. So I'm going to take the inside portion and the outside portion, pin them together, and I'm going to sew these with my sewing machine. I'm also going to be taking the body pieces, the left and the right. I'm going to pin them together, and we're going to be sewing down the belly portion. So I'm going to do this with my sewing machine as well. And then another thing that I need to pin together real quick for sewing is the fabric for the wings. So the wings are going to have a top and a bottom, so I'm going to pin these together, and we're going to sew all the way around them, leaving the base open so we can flip them right side out. So I'm going to get all that sewing done with my sewing machine, and then we're going to work a little bit more on the wings because I need to make a wire frame for them. Now the wings that I'm doing for this piece, I'm trying something out a little bit different. Normally I just make a wire that runs down the very top of the wing to make it posable, but this time around I want to add wires to all the finger pieces and have them connect. So I'm going to make kind of a complicated wire frame. I'm just going to measure out all the portions that I need, cut wires to it, and then I'm going to use Instamorph to connect everything together. If you guys haven't seen me use Instamorph, it's just kind of a moldable plastic that you can melt down and shape. So I'm going to use my Instamorph to put the wireframe together. While it's cooling, I decided that I wanted to add some claws to the wings, so I also made those out of Instamorph as well. For the claws, to make them a slight bit of a creamy color, I did add a little bit of paint to the Instamorph and just blended everything together. And then once our Instamorph has hardened and our wireframe is all combined, we're going to run our fabric for the wings over this. I left holes for where the little claws are going to go, and I'm going to poke those through and glue the fabric around the bases of them. So now what we need to do is we need to take our wire frame and kind of combine it more with the fabric. So we're basically sewing all those wires into place on the fabric so they stay in place inside of the wing. That way they don't move around and stuff like that, they're actually sewn into place. So I'm going to take a white thread to match the fabric that we're using, and I'm going to basically sew around that wire, combining the fabric to it. So we're just kind of wrapping the wire inside of the wing. And we're going to do this to all the finger pieces. And then once we have all of the little finger wires in place, we're going to take our sewing machine and be very careful with this because the wings are going all over the place. And we're going to sew a little pocket around the wire for that wing. So we're just kind of making an arm shape that we can stuff later. Okay, so our wings are done, our clay pieces are finally cured, and most of our fabric has been sewn so we can start putting our body together. So I made a very simple wireframe. It's a little reinforced in the front because the head's kind of heavy but not too heavy, and we're going to start putting everything on this. I'm going to start by adding the wings to it, so I'm going to take the wireframe that we have in the wings and we're going to combine it with the wireframe for the body. So I'm going to take a thinner gauge and I'm just going to wrap these together in place. I'm going to make sure they're nice and secure, and then what we can do is we can take the fabric for the body. We're going to cut some holes for the wires for the legs, and we're going to slide this over the wireframe. Now I'm going to grab the clay head that we made earlier and I'm going to glue this onto the wire for the neck. We're going to let that dry a little bit, and then we can take the fabric for the neck and glue it around the base of the head. And then we're also going to take that fur fabric that we have for the back of the dragon and glue this at the very top of the head. We're going to let that dry a little bit, and then we can start sewing up and closing our body. So I'm going to start with the neck and just sew down both sides of it, and then we can stuff it. We're going to stop once we get to the portion where the wings are, and we're going to have to start sewing those in place as well as we're closing up the body. So to make it a little bit easier, I decided to sew the under portion of the wing first and then sew the top portion. And that way I don't have to sew all the layers together. It's just making it a little bit easier for myself. And then once I get past that point, I'm going to stuff the rest of the body and continue going down the base of the tail. So I'm going to keep stuffing as I'm going until everything is completely closed up. Now what we need to do is we need to get ready to add the legs. So I'm going to take that pattern that we made and I'm going to use that to kind of mark out where we're going to sew the legs onto the body. So I'm going to cut that out and kind of trace around it very lightly. And then I'm going to take the fabric for the legs and we're going to sew these into place following those lines. So the under portion of the leg is going to go under the wire, and then the shoulder portion of the leg is going to go over the wire and around. And we're basically closing up the wire inside of the leg. Once I have the shoulders stuffed, I'm going to take a piece of fabric from the wing that we didn't sew into place, and the reason we didn't sew this into place is because we're going to sew it on top of the shoulder blade. So I'm going to stuff that portion of the wing and then we're going to close it up on top of the shoulder blade. That way we kind of have a bit more of a muscle structure going, and it just shapes the body a bit better. And then after we have that in place, I'm going to take our clay legs for the front legs and we're going to adjust the length of the wire and wrap these onto the wireframe with a thinner gauge. So I'm going to make sure they're nice and secure on the wireframe, and then we can take the fabric for the legs and start gluing them around the bases of the clay feet. We're going to have to let those dry a little bit, and then we can stuff and close up the front legs. After the front legs are done, we're going to move on to doing the back legs, and they're going to be done basically the same way as the front legs, except they're going to be a little bit easier now that we don't have to mess with the wings. So the under portion goes under the wire, the more hip portion goes over the wire, and then we're going to take the wires for the legs, shorten them to the right size, and then we can add the clay feet to the ends of these. Glue the fabric into place, let it dry, stuff, and close everything up. Okay, so the body is all put together. Now I'm going to start adding some decorations here and there. I decided that the back legs looked a little too scrawny, so I'm going to add a little bit of white fur fabric to the back of them to make them look just a little fluffy. And then I wanted to add a bit more of a ghostly effect to the mane of the dragon, so I'm going to take some kind of translucent fabric. This is just really sheer white fabric, and I'm going to kind of bunch it up and sew it into place on the sides of the fur fabric, and then I'm also going to sew a strip of it going in the middle of the fur fabric, kind of making it look like a veil. And then lastly, I wanted to add a little bit of a scaling to the body, just a tiny bit. So I'm going to take my 3D fabric paints, I'm going to use my pearlescent, and I'm going to add just little dots here and there to make some scales. And then we just need to let this dry. Okay guys, and that's how I made a ghost dragon. I had so much fun making her. I think she came out both beautiful and creepy at the same time. I think there's a good balance of the two. And I'm going to have her along with a bunch of other creatures in my Etsy shop. So if you guys want to buy anything, make sure to check the links down below for that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe to all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Happy Halloween!